Now that goes to that phrase that was first used in the federal courts, I think in the 1940s. The Constitution is not a suicide pact. Meaning once you have agreed to it, you don't have a right to opt out unless everyone agrees that there is such a right and that the whole will be changed by the will of everyone. I actually read this principle that Washington puts down as a principle that would be used in argument against, say, states' rights and the right simply to secede from the Union. But by that time, those states and their governments believed that they could do that. So Washington's concern, far and above the question of foreign entanglements, has to do in large measure with the difficulty of keeping the country together when it was being threatened by very divisive forces even at that time. On page 92, if you look at the left-hand column halfway down, I'd like to call your attention to the language that Washington uses here, which is very strong. He says that certain kinds of combinations and associations of individuals, under whatever plausible character, can become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterward the very engines which have lifted them to unjust domination. It's a remarkable sentiment on the part of Washington. He says in the next column, I think explaining the reason why he would view this as entirely possible, a just estimate, this is not quite halfway down the second column, a just estimate of that love of power and proneness to abuse it, which predominates in the human heart, is sufficient to satisfy us of the truth of the position. I don't know that anyone could actually say this today in public. It would be hard to say, because people would immediately say, oh, you're saying human nature is evil or inherently faulty. And Washington isn't quite saying that, but what he is saying is that a love of power and proneness to abuse it predominates. Look at that verb, predominates in the human heart. This is Washington. This is not some person who's a naïf or an abstract social theorist. This is a person who has lived through 2 wars, has been a president for 2 generations, and has pretty much so seen the nadir of his cause and almost been defeated in it. And yet he is warning against a predominance in the human heart of an estimate for that love of power and proneness to abuse it. The very opposite of what you want to have as the qualities of a good orator or the qualities of a good government. And the interesting thing is, neither Franklin nor Washington ever say, at least to my knowledge, that don't worry, you can all be protected by this, by the institutions of government. They never say that. They trust the institutions of government, but in the end, what is the only protection against what Washington is describing? What's left? If the government itself can be usurped in the way he describes, what is the real bulwark against doing that? What will stop it?
The people of that country?
The
people?
Presumably the people. Presumably. There's nothing left. The representatives of the people created the institutions. They created the government. If the government becomes corrupted from within, you've only got to go to the sovereign power, and the sovereign power is not the institutions. The sovereign power is the people. So let's flip to page 93, and we get back now to this theme that Adams brought forward about education. Adams talks about the university or the college. And here's Washington. This is on the left column on page 93. Promote then, as an object of primary importance, institutions, not government institutions, but institutions for the general diffusion of knowledge. In proportion as the structure of a government gives force to public opinion, it is essential that public opinion should be enlightened. Now, Washington doesn't do it here, but guess what? If you read this paragraph, this little short paragraph, guess what George Washington wanted to establish? Doesn't say it here, but he did want to establish it, and it never happened.
Public education?
Yes, public education in a wide sense, but he had a very specific idea for an institution that would help promote public. He couldn't, I think at that time, promote public education federally. That's up to each state. But what could he do as a national leader? What might he advocate as a national leader if he wanted to promote some form of public education? Come on, use your imagination. You're the first president of the United States. You're ending your second term. You have federal power. You control a national government. You can go to Congress and ask for money. You're going to try to do something for public education, but you can't tell each state how to run its public education. So what might you do? What's a possibility?
Couldn't you do something in D.C.?
Yes, you could. And that's what Washington proposed. He wanted to establish a national university in Washington, D.C. That's what he wanted. Never happened. And we would wait all the way until 1862, until the Morrill Act, until the land-grant universities were established by an act of Congress in individual states. Never had a national university. I don't think we ever will. Maybe it wouldn't be a good idea now, but that's what Washington wanted. And that is why he thought it was so important, because it would give force to public opinion. And it was upon public opinion that the government ultimately rested. Not the institutions themselves, good or bad as they were, but upon the credit and faith that people had in them. And that is why Adam says it is the credit and faith you have in an orator or a writer that ultimately makes the difference. Doesn't mean you, in fact, will always agree with that person either. You ever read a columnist or an editorial by someone, a person you admire and you generally like them, but you're just not on the same page with them on a particular issue? Yeah, okay, I don't agree with you on that one. You might read someone say, I agree with you on the following 9 things, but not on school vouchers or something like that. It happens. People don't always agree exactly on the issues, even though you may trust someone. You trust someone, you may not always agree with them, but you still trust them. So it doesn't enforce agreement. It enforces simply trust and, importantly, a willingness to listen. A willingness to trust that the argument being presented to you is one that is not being made in a duplicitous, two-faced kind of way, in a cynical kind of way. So, now we're going to turn to Joe McCarthy. This is in our own words. It's on page 173. You have a little head note to this, which I ask you to read, but I wanted to add shortly to it. Richard Nixon, who later became president, Joseph McCarthy, and many others, turned their attention to the affair of Alger Hiss, H-I-S-S. Alger Hiss was an individual who had worked in the State Department and had been a government employee, and a very important position, series of positions. And Alger Hiss came under suspicion for being an agent of the Soviet Union. And there was a man named Whittaker Chambers who was associated in presenting evidence about Hiss's complicity with the Soviet Union. This occupied news cycles for a long time in the United States. And finally, Alger Hiss was convicted not of being a Soviet agent, but of committing perjury. And he was sentenced to two prison terms of 5 years to run concurrently. He spent about 3.5 years in jail, got out in the mid-50s. To his dying day in 1996, he protested his innocence. To this day, there are still vociferous arguments among responsible historians about whether Alger Hiss was in fact a Soviet agent or not. He may very well have been. There is quite a bit of evidence to point to that. There is also some evidence to point to the fact that some of the evidence brought against him was fabricated. There is a typewriter that he and his wife owned, And it was said that things that were typed on that typewriter could be traced to that typewriter. And since what was typed on it was essentially a spy document, then it must have belonged to the Hisses. But then there was later an accusation that that typewriter, which was then miraculously found later after they had thrown it out, had actually had a new set of keys placed in it, a new set of strikes placed in it. You know what strikes are in little letters that go up and make the mark on the paper? And that someone had basically reverse engineered that typewriter so it would appear that it had written those documents. Yeah. I don't know whether that's true or not. Historians don't agree on it. The guilt or innocence of Alger Hiss is still a matter of debate among people who have researched and researched and researched the case. It does seem he did lie under oath. And it seems entirely possible he was an agent of the Soviet Union. But now what does Joe McCarthy do with this? He gives this speech just very shortly after Alger Hiss has been convicted. Today, he says, we are engaged in a final, all-out battle between communistic atheism and Christianity. Well, you couldn't get any more definite than that. And what kind of battle is it? It's a final battle. Final battle. To me, this conjures up certain images of sort of the apocalypse. Well, it could have been a final battle. I was alive during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviet Army officer in Cuba who was in charge of the nuclear missiles that were in Cuba, that were aimed at the United States, actually had the personal authority to launch those missiles. He didn't need to call Moscow. We now know that. And what would have happened if he'd sent those missiles towards, say, Miami or Washington, D.C.? I think there would have been a pretty good chance there would have been some kind of thermonuclear war, the consequences of which are incalculable. So, although this language sounds apocalyptic, in another 12 years it would certainly not be considered apocalyptic. The stakes were becoming that high. The Soviet Union acquired the atomic bomb much more quickly than the United States thought it could. And then the Soviet Union acquired the hydrogen bomb as well. Lest there be any doubt that the time has been chosen, let us go directly to the leader of communism today, Stalin. Here is what he said, not back in 1928, but 2 years after the war ended. To think that the communist revolution can be carried out peacefully within the framework of a Christian democracy means one has either gone out of one's mind and lost all normal understanding, or has grossly and openly repudiated the communist revolution. And it was seen as a battle. Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, in the early 1960s said, quote, "We will bury you." B-U-R-Y, we will bury you. You take that either metaphorically or literally, however you want to take it. The Cold War was not a pleasant time to live in. I think most people kept their sanity by just imagining that it really wouldn't happen, meaning an all-out nuclear war really wouldn't happen. Sometime I hope you see the movie Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. It is a very dark, satirical, brilliant movie, and it was made in the early 60s near the height of the Cold War. But then McCarthy goes on. Turn, please, if you could, to 174, in the middle of the page. The reason why we find ourselves in a position of impotency is not because our only powerful potential enemy has sent men to invade our shores. No, it's not that cause and effect. It's another cause and effect. But rather because of the traitorous actions of those who have been treated so well by this nation. Now, there's the beginning of the accusation. It's not that the Soviets have launched an attack. It's not that they're going after us. It's that there are individuals in the United States who have committed traitorous actions, and moreover, they've been treated very well already by the country. They're favored. They're favored people. Then he says, this is glaringly true in the State Department. They're the bright young men who are born with silver spoons in their mouths. Now, what does it mean to be born with a silver spoon in your mouth? Privilege. Why is that image used? Where does it come from? Well, if your family has a lot of money, what is one of the first things you get your little baby? A silver spoon, yes. Go to Tiffany's online and you will still see silver spoons and silver various things. And, I don't think there's anything wrong with it at all, but McCarthy is using the image as something to say, look, these people can afford a silver spoon for their babies, which was a lot harder for a lot of people to afford then than it is now. But yes. Then, famous moment. I have here in my hand a list of 205, a list of names that were made known to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party and who nevertheless are still working and shaping policy in the State Department. 205 names. I have here in my hand. Did he ever divulge those names? No, he never divulged those names. Whether he had 205 names on that list, I don't know. That's some tactic, though. That's some tactic. How would you like it? How would you like it if somebody on the faculty got up and said, I have here in my hand a list of 205 students who have cheated on their exams? Wow. Ouch. Not nice. Talk about beginning to sow distrust, beginning to sow fear, beginning to sow suspicion. Then he says, one thing to remember, and this is the bottom of the page, in discussing the communists in our government. Now, he's already assuming they're there. That's fairly interesting rhetorical move. The communists in our government. Now, let's stop for a second. Were there some communists in the government? Yes, there were. There were. And prosecutions, including successful prosecutions for Soviet or Russian agents, went on all through the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and there are still people serving time for having done that. There was a man in the Navy named John Walker who sold secrets to Russia, I believe. And his friends later in the Navy, who ceased to be his friends, called him Johnny Walker Red. You have to know your liquor brands. No, I'm glad many of you didn't get that, okay? It's a Scotch. Johnny Walker Red is a Scotch. They called him Johnny Walker Red. But yes, there were. So, is there some truth on the side of McCarthy? Yes, there is. Richard Hofstadter wrote a wonderful book called Anti-Intellectualism in American Life. And Andy Delbanco, who teaches at Columbia, says the most insidious thing about the demagogue is that along the way he may express, as Richard Hofstadter has said in his great essay on the paranoid style in American politics, the demagogue may express certain defensible judgments. That is to say, certain things will be said that turn out to be true. Then McCarthy goes on to talk about a conspiracy so immense, a great conspiracy, a conspiracy on a scale so immense as to dwarf any previous such venture in the history of man. That's fairly inflated language. But when people hear about a conspiracy, and that phrase has been used on both the right and the left of the political spectrum. Don't forget that. That is an equal opportunity phrase. Candidates, major political candidates of both the Republican and the Democratic Party have used the phrase conspiracy about their opposition at different times. Then McCarthy goes on to call upon the moral quality of the American people, because he says this is a story of high treason. Was it a story of high treason? Yes, in a few instances, without doubt. Was it a story of 205 people infesting the government with high treason? No, it was not. Were certain judgments true? Yes. Did his audience know at that time what was true or not? No, they didn't. They didn't know whether those 205 names were right or wrong. Did they know that someone had just been convicted of lying to the government? Yes. McCarthy then, for a period of years, succeeded in pushing his agenda very strongly, because he then calls upon a moral uprising on the part of 140 million American people. Now, this address in February of 1950 was supposed to be an address, interestingly enough, dedicated to the memory of Abraham Lincoln. It's true. Lincoln has very often been invoked by individuals who themselves are not always honest. The great Lincoln savings and loan scandal of the 1980s is a perfect example of that. Take the name Lincoln and put it on a savings and loan and then cheat the people who've made deposits. I can think of another example when Richard Nixon went before the country to talk about Watergate and told some untruths. He had behind him, among other things, a small bronze statuette of Abraham Lincoln.